bringing you another fine podcast from Art Report Today.
I'm Michael Delgado, and I'm on special assignment for ArtReportToday.com. And my guest tonight is the internationally acclaimed Los Angeles-based artist, Lezley Saar. Saar has been making captivating work, primarily paintings, since 1989, and soon joined her more famous mother, Betty Saar, and equally accomplished sister, Allison Saar, in a successful career that now finds her work in the collections of notable museums around the world, including the Kemper, MoCA, California African Museum, and the Auckland Art Museum, among others. Currently represented by the Walter Maciel Gallery in Los Angeles, Saar addresses the concepts of race, gender, mental health, and belonging in engaging narrative ways. I asked her about her most recent show, Conjuring, Conjurers, which mines a rich vein of spirituality, magic, and mysticism that goes even further than the exquisitely crafted photo collages from 2019.
Well, each time I do a show, I come up with a specific theme, and this last show that was at Walter Maciel Gallery was called The Conjuring of Conjurers, and that one was more sort of spiritual and about the occult and about magic or mysticism. But actually what it inspired the show was I'd read this book by yours, Carl Usman, Araba, or Against the Grain, Against Nature. And when I finished reading, it's like, I want to do a show about that. But that's about this sort of aristocratic guy who retires from society and sets up his own sort of dream realm of the senseless type of house, and explores all of the arts and senses through like smell, taste, whatever, touch, vis-a-vis, art, literature, what have you. And because I'm kind of a hermit too, and I was sort of thinking about creating one's own reality, conjuring one's own reality. So you get an idea like that, like, okay, well, how am I going to present it? I'm not going to literally illustrate this book. Then I came up with this idea of conjuring, because what he had done was, this is an old book, it's like from the late 1800s, but it was written before Proust, in Search of Lost Time. So, but it's very, very detailed, beautifully written, really, really funny. It doesn't really have much of a plot. It's this guy and how he centered on how he wanted to create this house and just have control of everything in it. So I thought, well, okay, so how can I do this that has relevance to me or even visually? And I came up with this idea of conjuring, and that can have to do with creating your own reality or magic or conjurers that would go back to Africa and Haiti and New Orleans and voodoo and all of those kinds of things. So I just sort of latched onto that way of expressing the idea. And then so it was sort of like the totems, these tall characters are the conjurers conjuring this art, but every piece of art is a portrait of someone, and each person had their own little story, their own little expose about what their powers were or their experience or their mojo or what have you. So that's how that show came about.
If Saar's approach sounds very cinematic in a sort of Guillermo del Toro sort of way, it is. It all comes across theatrically, like a play, but one in which the actors and their interactions are defined more by visual cues than dialogue.
No, that's exactly what I had in mind. I'm glad you saw that, because I wanted to really group them together and kind of form this tableau, and though each piece could be, I guess, work within itself and sell by itself, but I wanted to create this kind of narrative in this story, exactly like a play or a tableau. And I was going back and forth with my dealer. He's like, well, people need to see them. And I'm like, yeah, but I want them close together. And we sort of had a compromise,
Right. And if it were a movie, I mean, you give us plenty of movie for our money. I mean, the images and each of the portraits are packed with, I guess they're symbols, eggs and birds and snakes and scorpions. But they also, all of those have like varying interpretations depending on the spiritual heritage, right? Like snakes mean one thing context,
Right.
and quite another.
Exactly. Right. Depending on the culture, a snake can be a sign of the initial evil or what have you, or it can be a sign of fertility in other cultures. And yeah, sort of what I did in this show was a combination of symbolism and surrealism. I've used surrealism in a lot of shows. It's my way of kind of questioning things, questioning notions like, as you said earlier, of race and normalcy and gender and beauty and all of that kind of thing. And if you're juxtaposing objects or symbols in such a way to make the person go, huh, and then they're reading or considering the context of the theme of this show, it's a way to get someone to question without me being pounding someone on the head with a hammer, you know.
Prior to the Conjuring exhibition we've been discussing, Saar explored sexuality in a show called Gender Renaissance. The work was inspired by her experience with her son, who was not only transitioning, but was also neurologically atypical, what some term high-functioning autistic. Saar spent significant time supporting them through numerous doctor visits and surgeries. Saar's artwork in the end was not about trying to portray someone else's reality, but rather to present questions for the rest of us.
So I felt I had a pretty first-hand idea of what it was like to transition. But at the same time, his concept of becoming a man, who's formerly a girl, was so different. Like, he likes to wear capes and still likes to knit or have his hair quite long. And I'm like, well, you can't get terribly upset if someone misgenders you. You're wearing cape, you know. That's his perception of what it is to be himself, and he considers himself a male. So in that show, I was just sort of questioning gender, just not this whole idea of being trans, but even within trans and the fluidity of that, and what is masculinity and what is femininity. And I just thought a good way of doing that is just throwing in images of nature. There's lots of birds' nests and eggs and flowers, and nature is natural, right? Like, anyone trans is natural. But juxtaposing them with some odd thing that would just sort of make you question, well, is it masculinity or femininity or, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the work's fascinating that way because, as you say, it's not, you don't leave it necessarily open-ended, but you don't, there's subtle, it's left for subtle interpretation, I guess I would say.
For some time in her career, Saar's pieces have included decidedly Victorian or antebellum imagery. Many pieces include Victorian-era photographs, and others may evoke the era's clothing, fabrics, and frames. I asked her how she decided to center her work in this period.
It's really interesting because I looked at things, I started doing painting at least in the early 1990s, 1990, and I've always just sort of used that as a way of presenting my portraits. Number one is the antebellum period, anything between 1860 and later that is significant with regards to African American history and colonization and all of that kind of thing. And it's also the time that you actually had photography, so you could see images of Black people or any people. So, I mean, I don't predominantly do portraits of Black people, but quite a few are the whole spectrum of, what it is to be Black. And so there's that sort of truth, that reality there. And then there's a very Gothic aspect to it. I'm pretty fond of the Gothic aesthetic. And I just sort of liked aesthetically and for all those other reasons that period. And then I try to take a current thing that's going on either in my life personally or something political and I like to set it in the past, kind of say like, well, this has been going on a long time, like people didn't just all of a sudden become trans, or there hasn't been racial questioning just now. But I kind of like to set it in the past, to sort of say that it's been going on for a long time, and to also, I don't know, just by giving it a distance kind of is easier, or my preferred way of getting a point across. It's less obvious, it's less, I would do a very cheesy painting if I were to set it in the present and address being trans. It just wouldn't, I couldn't pull it off. You know what I'm saying? There's something at a distance to it, just like how someone likes to do a cartoon to get a point across. There's something sort of subtle about it, and first it might kind of have this alluring, melancholic Victorian Gothic aura to it, but I'm trying to say something that's politically happening now, or socially, or going on with me right now.
It is very difficult to work with the past, since an audience will always bring a varying degree of understanding about that history. When I asked Saar if she tried to manage such expectations, she said that she did think about it, but that she couldn't be too obsessed with what someone might or might not take away from the work. And in that previous cinematic manner I mentioned, Saar is more interested in transporting her viewer back and forth in both time and scale.
I like also someone, at least for me, to get the feeling that I'm being transported, you know, and kind of a back and forth thing. I've done this series called Monad, where again these women were in these Victorian outfits floating around in space, and there was a very bright palette, more kind of neon almost palette, and I sort of done this notion of as above, so below, or monad, which is the spark, and I did this reversal of scale, so they're floating around on these small planets, but these planets were actually mitochondrial, or these sort of biological illustrations of cells, and very minute, you know, but here they are floating in space in the universe, so it was from the macrocosm to the microcosm and that kind of thing. So I particularly wanted them to be in Victorian costume, so it was sort of this time travel of past to the future, and from the large scale to the small scale, this whole sort of bouleversé, this kind of reversal of scales and time frames, and I just like jumbling things up and making them complex, and then the nature of the layer of painting on existing fabric, and then adding other fabrics, and I'm into multi-layers, the way the work are constructed with the materials, and then with the ideas, and then also with the imagery in the painting. So
Saar's work is very rich in its layers, and this gives them the power to draw you in, seeking out a narrative while being suspended in time and among various historical references. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Saar is part of a notable artistic family. Her mother, Betty, has recently been gaining long overdue institutional recognition with a show last year at LACMA, and has even more recently had her politically tinged work from the 80s being elevated among today's animated Black Lives Matter conversations. You're probably familiar with her gun-toting Aunt Jemima characters, and if not, you must check them out. Lezley also has a sister, Allison, who shows with the LA Louvre Gallery and is recognized worldwide in her own right. I thought it must be like being part of a family of amazing athletes, and I wondered if there was a sense of competition.
When we were young, I mean, growing up, my mother was an artisan and teaching, but she didn't have the notoriety when I'm growing up. So we're all already grown when everyone's starting to get their reputations and such. And initially, I must say, because my father was also an artist, and he was more classically trained, but I didn't major in art. I felt it sort of would have shown a complete lack of imagination to do the same thing that both of my parents did. So I actually majored in communications, radio, TV, film, and worked for a while at a radio station at KPFA in Berkeley, and I was really, really into it, and that was just going to be my future. I mean, it was great. It was great working there during the 70s and all the radio shows we did, because that was the time of, was a little after the Black Panthers, but I was doing one show once, and like Eldridge Cleaver and Kathleen Cleaver, they showed up, and they're like, oh, they want to be on the air. It's like, okay. I mean, it was incredible. So that's what I was interested in. I wasn't really thinking about, I need to become any way competitive with my mom or my sister. And so it wasn't until I was quite a bit older, when I was pregnant with my first child, that I was sort of home anyway, and I started making these books. I started by making books, but so to the more present time as opposed to growing up. I don't really look at it as being in competition with them. We all do something different. My mother does assemblage and, mixed media collages and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Allison's more known for her sculpture. Just thematically, there are things different. I mean, I think you can see a common thread, It's not like one person just does minimalism or something sort of
right.
installation, but I focus on painting, and we're a really tight, strong family, and I have another sister, a younger sister, Tracy, and we all just get along really, really great. And there's just a lot of love.
Well, I was hoping she would dish some dirt, but it's refreshing to hear about a functioning family these days. As Lezley mentioned, the Saars share a similar visual vocabulary, and a majority of Lezley's work includes images of black people, but not overtly political statements like an armed Aunt Jemima. I asked Lezley about her thoughts on the role of the artist, and specifically the artist of color, in the chaotic moment we find ourselves now.
What can I actually say that's important? Is like what is even the importance of art right now? And it just all seems so, I don't know, superficial and arbitrary. And so I just have quite a standstill now. I mean, I didn't want to do art about the COVID pandemic or anything. And I don't know that I can literally do an art about police brutality or these kinds of things. But I do think when this kind of stuff is going on, that I personally need some time for all the dust for it to settle and me to really. It always take a really, really long time before I decide what the next theme is. It has to be something personal, something that I feel is not necessarily unique to me, but to me it would be a new story or a new way of presenting something to other people. It's sort of like this thing of like, well, where did you get the idea? It's not just because like I wanted to work with the color blue or something like that. It has to be something that is meaningful to me and personal. And so, I can do political things. I did a show about race and what is race and questioning that, because I pretty much present as being white, but I consider myself to be black with my mother and my family and my upbringing and that kind of thing. So I did a show called Mulatto Nation, and I did other shows sort of just about anomalies and kind of questioning what was normalcy and all of that. And so I guess they're not political in that sense, maybe more cultural. So definitely what's going on now is more political. I don't quite know where my mind is going with all of this, I'm not
Well, I'll be very excited to see what Lezley comes up with as a theme after she ruminates on our historic moment. In the interim, I asked about a show scheduled for next year at the Craft Contemporary that will hopefully take place under more normalized conditions.
I'm excited. I'm going to have a solo show at Contemporary Craft in the larger gallery upstairs, and I want to continue. I think for this show I really can do the tableau idea of placing individual works of art, maybe some more of the totem conjurer type figures of new banners and new paintings, and instead of creating a story for each individual painting, I sort of do a narrative, write a whole story for these groupings that I've made, these sort of plays or tableaus. So I'm excited about that. And that'll be in 2 years, sometime 2022. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's exciting. Very cool. Well, I think unless you have something you want to rant on, you have a bully pulpit. You can say whatever you want.
No, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed talking to you.
I did too. It was a real pleasure. Hopefully we'll see each other in real life soon. All right. Well, you be safe and stay well. And I guess hopefully we'll meet up soon.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Thanks again.
Thanks, Lezley.
You've been listening to a special report for ArtReportToday.com. My guest tonight has been the amazing artist Lezley Saar. You can learn more about her and her work through her gallery's website, WalterMacielGallery.com. That's Walter, MACIEL gallery.com, or you can Google Lezley Saar, and that's spelled LezleySaar. You'll also find information about her artistic family, her mother Betty, and her sister Allison when you do that. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. I'm Michael Delgado. Thanks for listening.
This has been a production of Art Report Today. Find your inspiration in the arts every day at artreporttoday.com.